Good afternoon, viewers. I am Shankar Kumar. I teach history at Hindu College here at University of Delhi, and welcome to this series of lectures on modern European history. And this particular episode is more about an overview. I have earlier spoken to you about the first part of this overview, and this is in continuation to the part 1 of my lecture. So, I have earlier spoken to you about modernity, beginning of modernity in European history, and conventionally it is the Renaissance, Reformation that are regarded as the harbingers of modernity, followed by the commercial revolution, shift of economic focus from Mediterranean to the Atlantic, all happening across the 16th, 17th centuries, followed by the scientific revolution, followed by the Enlightenment writers talking about enlightened ideas of liberty, individualism, republicanism, citizenship, voting, and so forth, and also against the institution of slavery and so forth. So, that constitutes the preface of the beginning of modernity, and in more technical sense of the term, the way it is dished out to the students across universities as part of modern Europe curriculum, it is the beginning of the iconic French Revolution that is regarded as the point of departure so far as early modern period and the modern period is concerned. Of course, this is not to underemphasize the more, I would say, critical factor of change and transformation that was also happening in England in the form of the Industrial Revolution. Both are almost contemporary. So, 1770s, 1780s, 1790s is the time when there is economic transformation happening on account of the Industrial Revolution emanating from England to begin with, and some of the sectors like textile, iron, steel, and mining, that is coal, and it was also gradually spreading to other spaces in Europe, and over a period of time, particularly by the middle of the 19th century, we find that most of the major European countries like Germany, France, and England, they had fairly industrialized, and of course, this industrialization was to spread to other areas also. It was an ongoing process happening in different waves, and there are 3 distinct waves that are spoken of so far as industrialization is concerned. So, that took this transformation to different areas of Europe, all right, but in political terms, it is the iconic French Revolution that triggered it all, because that's the visible face of change that we get to see in political terms, because that's when a very drastic kind of a break with past is attempted at. To begin with, of course, then there are different phases of the revolution, of the French Revolution. To begin with, it appeared to be an attempt, a kind of constitutional attempt by forming National Assembly and doing away with the state system, the conventional state system of Europe, and coalescing all the 3 states into one, and transforming that into individual citizens who are enabled by the voting rights, and therefore that state system is lost sight of or wishfully done away with, and a new order based on egalitarianism or equality is attempted at, and that is the high point of the French Revolution. That is what gives it so much of glow and you can say optics so far as this change is concerned. In the previous lecture, the first part of this lecture, I have spoken about the units, the timeline that can be used as one homogeneous unit or one time bracket, that is 1789, the beginning of the French Revolution, to up to 1850 as the period of revolutions. And that would cover not only the French Revolution, the different stages of French Revolution, the Napoleonic Empire experimentation, the Vienna Congress, and you can say relapsing of all these changes into the conventional monarchical system. Then 1830 period, where you have a little bit of clustering of quite a few revolutions, and then finally the 1858 revolution. So all these can be studied under one time bracket with some semblance of uniformity and homogeneity. There is some you can say convenience of ideas and trajectories that can be utilized to treat this period as one. Next to it, from 1850 onwards, we have another thematic, or you can say chronologically consistent unit that can be made out of the 19th century Europe, and that is industrial revolution and social transformation across the 19th century. So if you talk about French Revolution, Napoleonic experimentation, the Vienna Congress, 1830, 1848, alongside that, what perhaps gets missed out, and I tangentially referred to this in my earlier lecture as well, part 1 of this, the consequences following out of industrial revolution, not only in economic terms, but also its ramifications for the social order, for social transformation. So, as a subunit of this, we tend to study about the processes of capitalist development in industry and agriculture. So, it's not only about mechanized production in factories, in towns and so forth, but even agriculture was getting mechanized. Those of us who are aware of the Indian reality, when we have British coming to rule over India to begin with in the Bengal province, we get to hear of the permanent settlement, and the permanent settlement, the period of Cornwallis and so forth, is all about infusing some kind of a capitalist spirit, or at least an attempt to infuse capitalist ethos in Indian agricultural scenario. The intended attempt is to bring about some kind of a mechanization or commercialization of agriculture. That did not happen because it was a colonial context in which it was happening, and colonial context has inbuilt distortions into it, and obviously that would not lead to a genuine capitalist transformation. Colonial conditions are such, but we are not talking of the Indian reality. In Europe, where you did not quite have some kind of a colonial context of these changes, these industrial transformations can be studied with reference to its impact not only on industry but also on agriculture. Changing class structure, and this is something which is very visible in countries like France, Germany and Russia. So you have the earlier state system is giving rise to a different kind of churning that is happening at the social level. France and Germany is giving out a different kind of social ordering. In fact, all these changes were happening even before this, at the behest of absolutist monarchies in the early modern period, because they also needed the social support, bloc support of different segments of society, and that had some ramifications of its own. For example, in the Eastern Europe, The absolutist monarchies of the earlier period actually led to intensification of, I would say, serfdom. In other areas, particularly in western part of Europe, France, Britain, and so forth, it led to some kind of a genuine capitalist transformation. Similarly, the family life and gender also had a fair bit of impact to absorb as a result of industrial revolution, and there is something that we see. There you will find that the gender relations change because of the sheer fact that the locus of production has shifted from villages to urban centers, and that triggers migration. The families have to be oriented in a different way. So, joint families would give way to nucleated families. Labor becomes free from the traditional controls, social controls. However, it doesn't become free entirely, and it is bound in a different cycle of industrial production. And nevertheless, all these changes had intensified sensitivity around gender, and that is something that is sought to be studied as part of 19th century history with reference to the changes brought by industrial revolution. Towards the end of the lecture, I'll run through the readings, and that will take care of a very overview kind of visualization that you can make out of this. So, on this particular subtopic, you have Peter Stern's book, The Industrial Revolution in World History. You have Clive Treblincock writing about industrialization of modern Europe in Blanning edited book, The Oxford History of Modern Europe. You have Rondo Cameron's book, A New View of the European Industrialization, and this is an article in Economic History Review, so that can be made use of. Then these are some of the writings. You can note it down, and there are issues related to democratic spread of European history, because in the earlier interaction that I had with you, I did speak to you about the ideas of liberty, the ideas of individualism, the ideas of nation state or nationalities, the ideas of socialism. These are modern ideas essentially embedded in the 19th century European history. So, across territories or across monarchies and subsequently across nationalities and nation states, you have gradual spread of liberal democracy, the ethos of liberal democracy, so much so that even the Napoleonic Empire actually ended up disseminating the seeds of liberal or individualism to a great extent. The property relations were altered. The rule of law was introduced in several areas by default, merely because they were part of the Napoleonic Empire. And alongside, industrial revolution had been bringing about changes. So, some kind of a social constituency had already been created in these areas who could latch on to these liberal ideas of democracy and also socialism. Because when you talk of liberalism, please be mindful of the fact that alongside liberalism, socialism is also a byproduct of the same transformation, right? Because it is all being engendered by industrial revolution and so forth. And once a critical number of industrial workers come into being, they latch on to this idea with the ideology of Karl Marx, etc., writings of Karl Marx being available. So, around that also there is a fair bit of focus. Then the struggle for parliamentary democracy and civic or civil liberties in Britain, that constitutes a separate theme where you study about parliamentary changes or legislative changes, how the Chartist movement progressed, how the suffrage rights were incrementally increased to more and more number of people, how corn laws were dealt with. All these incremental legislative efforts have a story of its own, which give a distinct flavor to 19th century history. And then, of course, you have socialism, you have early socialist thoughts, you have Marxian socialism, and the debates and strategies deployed to bring about this transformation, the international working class movement. So, all these things are spoken of as syllabus coverage so far as 19th century European history is concerned, and these are some of the books that you can consult for this. I have just listed them. You can take a note of this. It's running on your screen. I'm not going to elaborate much on this. You can have a look at these books. And then the last segment of today's presentation is also in its bid to cover the history of 19th century Europe. You have the culture and society 1789 to 1850, and as I told in the previous part of this lecture, in part 1 of this lecture, that these are the rubrics that I have borrowed from the syllabus of proposed syllabus of University of Delhi for this paper, that is History of Modern Europe. So thanks to them. So my courtesy is to them. Then you have art and culture in revolutionary France, neoclassical art, reformation of the Royal Academies. This is what is studied as part of the cultural change, the change in the realm of intellectualism and aesthetics, the cosmopolitan culture that emerged in the 19th century Europe. You have romanticism in art and literature, and that also has to be studied in order to understand the cultural ethos, the transformed cultural ethos of 19th century. And then cities, the way they existed in 19th century Europe, the way it were different from the cities of the medieval times or even the Renaissance city-states. So, the industrial city-states give you a different flavor as compared to the Renaissance city-states or the medieval cities of Europe. So, that is also covered, and these are the readings for that. Again, I am just allowing it to run on your screen. You can take note of it, and if you just happen to lay your hands on to any or several of these books, I think you will be able to make a good overview understanding of 19th century Europe as such. And when we meet next, of course, I'll take it forward to other dimensions of 19th century or early 20th century modern European history, and then we will blow up each of these subunits into a separate discussion, half an hour discussion, and that's the scheme in which we would take forward this series of lectures on European history. Thank you.